Most of you know me. I'm Clay Dubie. I work for the USC US-China Institute. And today we're going to be looking at China's Dibao program, the social welfare scheme. Now, we all know that social inequality in China is large. And in fact, it rivals that of the United States, that there's great disparity across regions and within regions between rich and poor. Now, in November of last year, the Chinese government declared that poverty had been basically eradicated. But it was a very low threshold. You're talking about per capita income of roughly $400 a year. So it wasn't a very high bar. We're going to be looking at China's effort, like other countries, to address dire poverty, to somehow deal with that. And we're going to be looking at a program that perhaps in 2017 enrolled 60 million people, but wasn't that expensive, something like 30 billion US dollars. And our guide through this is the author of Welfare for Autocrats. And Professor Jennifer Pan comes to us from Stanford University, where she teaches at the intersection of communications and political science. She's an incredibly prolific and creative scholar. She's widely known for her work on China's internet management efforts and idea promotion efforts. She's written on both censorship and propaganda. And if you just looked at what she'd published in the last year, you'll see that she's been writing about television, news, and that role. She's also written about the work of local governments to try to increase their engagement with their populations through the use of clickbait. She's also written about how local officials might curate their story, these kinds of things. She is an incredibly creative scholar and one of the most technologically advanced that we've been privileged to welcome here to the USC US-China Institute. She teaches about big data. She knows all of these technologies and is infusing them into social science. We're extremely fortunate to have Professor Jennifer Pan with us today. Now she's going to talk, she has a presentation to share based on her years of research that led to this book, which, as you can see in the chat space, we've got a link to that so that if you'd like to get it at Oxford University Press, you'll be able to do that. Later, we'll also put up a link. Well, we've already got the link to her own website where you can get access to some of those papers that I just mentioned. So she'll be speaking, then we'll raise some questions and have some back and forth with Professor Pan. We want you to be a part of it. So please take advantage of that Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, type in your question, and we'll try to address as many of them as we can. Professor Jennifer Pan, thank you for being here. Welcome.
Today, it's my pleasure to have this opportunity to share with you my book, Welfare for Autocrats: How Social Assistance in China Cares for Its Rulers. As Clay mentioned, this book centers around one of China's social welfare programs, namely China's Minimum Livelihood Guarantee, or 中国最低生活保障, or Dibao for short. Dibao is a means-tested, non-conditional cash transfer program. So means testing means that anyone whose household per capita income falls below a certain locally set level, which is called the Dibao line, should be eligible. The program is unconditional, which contrasts with conditional cash transfer programs like Bolsa Familia in Brazil, where poor households only get money if they meet certain conditions, like vaccinate their children, send their children to school. Dibao is the largest such non-conditional cash transfer program in the world by population covered. And it's one of the few non-regressive social welfare programs in China. So there are many other welfare social policies in China, such as health insurance, that privilege the wealthy over the poor and increase income is administered by China's civil affairs system, Minzheng system. It's funded by central and local governments, but local governments are responsible in large part for setting the Dibao line and administering and implementing the program. While the evidence in my book centers around Dibao, the book is not about Dibao per se, but rather uses the Dibao program as a lens through which to examine the Chinese government's preoccupation with political order, or what it calls stability. And what this means is that by looking at Dibao, we can see how the Chinese government's pursuit of political order influences governance more broadly. So to give you an overview of my talk, I'll start with the impetus for writing this project about Dibao and political order. Then I'll trace how the priorities of political order entered into the Dibao program. Then I'll talk about how this works in practice. And then finally, I'll talk about the consequences of Dibao distribution. The empirical evidence for my book comes from a lot of different sources, everything from analysis of policy documents and speeches to an online experiment I conducted, to various types of surveys, as well as computational data analysis of social media content. But it all began with my qualitative fieldwork, where I originally set out to understand the logic behind distribution of Dibao benefits. These are pictures I took in neighborhoods I visited in one of the cities where I did my initial fieldwork. Whenever in this presentation I use the word neighborhood, I'm referring to the urban equivalent of villages. So neighborhoods in urban China are specific geographically delineated units which are administered by residence committees. Although they're supposed to be independent of China's formal administrative structure because they fall under the township level, they are in fact almost always coinciding with local party branches. And so it's very much part of the party regime. From 2012 to 2013, I interviewed more than 100 government officials, neighborhood administrators, as well as urban residents and Dibao recipients. And from these conversations, I encountered something a bit surprising. When I talked to policymakers and neighborhood administrators about the Dibao program and the rationale for who gets Dibao, their emphasis was always on budget constraints facing the program. They said money is limited, local governments have a lot of top-down mandates, and they can't fund them all. And the kind of data behind this is based on research by China's National Bureau of Statistics, as well as the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Consistently, they found that only 20 to 30% of households who should be eligible for Dibao get the benefit. So that's why I was asking these questions about why so few people get it, what determines who gets it. And so the policymakers I spoke to said, well, we have limited funds and there's a lot of opposition to welfare from both the public and businesses. This idea that social assistance like Dibao would decrease incentives to work, and policymakers said they face pressures not to make these benefits too widespread. And that as a result, Dibao was limited not only to the poor who are eligible based on income, but to those who could not work and participate in the labor market. So for example, this is the elderly who don't have families to support them, the ill, the disabled. And much of my fieldwork confirmed this orientation. I heard many stories of very poor households in urban China who were turned away from the Dibao program. They were told instead to work. But not everything fit into this picture. When I talked to residence committees about the type of people who receive Dibao, I also heard terms related to something called guizheng. So this was in addition to the disabled and elderly and the ill who are receiving benefits. And prior to this, I'd never done any work on repression in China, nothing about China's penal system, its re-education system, crackdowns on religious practice. So it took me some time to even understand what this term meant. And guizheng refers to return from prison, return from re-education. And as I dug into this more, what I realized is that there are two different logics to who gets Dibao, given this hard budget constraint. The first logic is what I heard initially from policymakers. Dibao is a safety net of last resort for people who cannot participate in the labor market. So it prioritizes people who are out of the labor market with low income, but denies potential workers who are poor. But in addition, there's a second logic distribution, which is distributing Dibao benefits to preempt threats to political order. And here, individuals are prioritized if they're seen as potential threats to political order, and they have low income. So the programmatic features of this policy are never violated, but the priority goes to populations who are labeled as threats to political order, while other households who are poor but who are not categorized as posing such a threat are denied benefits. So how did this all come about? What the Dibao program, as I mentioned before, is run by the Ministry of Civil Affairs. Did the Ministry of Civil Affairs decide one day they would distribute Dibao in this way? That's not the case. Neither is it the case that local governments decided, hey, I could buy people off with these benefits, let's do that. That's not what happened. The reason why Dibao is distributed to preempt threats to political order runs much broader and much deeper. It has to do with changes in the 2000s in how the Chinese government understood stability and how it pursued stability. Everyone who knows China is probably familiar with this quote from Deng Xiaoping in 1989, who said, "To China's problems, the overwhelming priority is stability. Without stable environment, nothing can be achieved, and what has been achieved will be lost." But we should also remember that at that point, stability wasn't the end all and be all. So even after Tiananmen Square, Deng's ultimate objective was economic modernization. He affirmed this in his 1992 Southern tour, and a year later in 1993, during the third plenum of the 14th Central Committee, the Central Committee adopted decisions of the CPC Central Committee on certain issues in establishing a socialist market economy system. So this is a crucial document for China's economic reforms, and in it calls for the development of a multi-layered social security system that would provide urban and rural residents with a degree of security commensurate to China's reality so as to promote economic development. And the idea post Tiananmen was that economic reform, specifically in particular privatization, would lead to social unrest and instability. That could hinder economic progress, so unrest had to be managed with social security, a social security net, so that modernization and economic development could continue. And this view was really supported by the type of protests that characterized China in the 1990s. But throughout the 1990s, the CCP dealt with mass unrest, mostly led by laid-off workers and pensioners who are suffering as a direct result of economic reforms. So this view made a lot of sense. But then you get 1999, where thousands of Falun Gong practitioners surrounded Zhongnanhai, representing the largest collective action event in Beijing since Tiananmen in '89. And most importantly, these protesters were not mobilized for economic grievances, but for social and political rights. And that, I find, is the beginning of how the CCP thought about stability. And over time, what you get is a very different type of causal relationship. Instead of economic development leading to instability, you have economic development seen as a way of promoting stability. And that's something I think that second view is what we're very familiar with today, given what we know about performance legitimacy and the work in that area. So not only did thinking about stability change, also the way in which the Chinese regime pursued stability changed. So in the aftermath of 1989, you see the emergence of the strategy called comprehensive management of public security. And this is replacing strike hard campaigns of previous decades. As part of comprehensive management of public security, you see many people in the public security apparatus becoming more powerful politically. And you see the linkage of promotions to suppression of protests and social mobilization. But after 1999, you see another revision in this strategy. In 2001, in the opinions on further strengthening the comprehensive management of public security, party organs at all levels of government was said that they can no longer rely only on the public security system to ensure political order. Instead, they needed to coordinate with all other functional bureaucracies to manage and achieve stability. And these bureaucracies included the civil affairs system, but also labor and social security, education, health, and family planning. And this changing understanding of stability and changing pursuit of stability through comprehensive management of public security is what leads to a process of informal institutional change that I term seepage. So seepage is a process where one government priority, political order, alters the allocation of resources and goals in unrelated areas of government. I look at the Dibao program, but in the Chinese case, I think this priority of political order has seeped into many other programs as well. And what happens with Dibao is that the formal rules of the program are never violated. They're not changed. But because of constraints on budgets, particular populations are prioritized for benefits. And so seepage leads to a change in the allocation of resources and hence the goals of the program. And that's how we end up with these two different logics of Dibao distribution. Okay, so how does this work on the ground? Who are these potential threats to political order? There's an official designation for individuals the Chinese government sees as potential future threats to the regime. They're called 重点人口, or targeted populations. So these are individuals for whom the regime does not have sufficient evidence to prosecute, but who are placed under surveillance and sometimes into community-based re-education in order to constrain their future behavior. And this category, this program, I guess, has been around since 1950, but the categories of who belongs into targeted populations has changed over time. So currently, targeted populations includes individuals who are suspected of having the potential to endanger state security. So that includes participating in disturbances, riots, revolts, threatening national security and social stability, participating in religious activities the regime has designated as illegal, damaging national unity or inciting unrest. It also includes people who are suspected of having the potential to create disturbances, so including key petitioners. And it includes categories of crime that would be considered criminal behavior anywhere in the world. So people suspected of having the potential to engage in crimes like murder, rape, human trafficking, fraud, etc. And finally, it also includes individuals who have been released from prison or labor reform in the last 5 years. Information about who is of individuals and programs that are public. So re-education programs are much more public. Information about released prisoners is much less sensitive. I'm going to give you a few examples of how seepage happens in the Dibao program. I'm going to show you some examples after Falun Gong protests of how public security began issuing both verbal instructions and policy documents that emphasize the provision of Dibao to populations they wanted to control, including specifically targeted populations. So for example, in September 2003, at a national conference on the comprehensive management of public security, the Minister of Civil Affairs emphasized that any targeted population who meet Dibao eligibility requirements should receive Dibao status and funds. In 2004, a county in Ningbo province began to actively recruit targeted populations for the Dibao program. In 2005, you see neighborhoods across Zhejiang province beginning to proactively help former prisoners get Dibao. In 2007, the Nanjing Bureau of Justice wrote that for targeted populations who meet eligibility criteria, education assistance, actually re-education assistance committees should introduce the details of these programs and help such individuals obtain benefits. In 2008, Chaoyang District in Beijing implemented rules for prioritizing released prisoners and those undergoing community re-education for programs such as Dibao. And what you'll notice is that many of these instructions and policies are issued not directly by civil affairs system, but through the public security and justice systems. But by emphasizing the provision of Dibao for targets of repression and control, this public security and justice departments are shifting the allocation of funding for the Dibao program and changing the composition of Dibao recipients. Okay, so how often are these benefits used to preempt disorder? I conducted a survey of 100 neighborhoods where I sampled 4 cities in different regions in China and then randomly sampled neighborhoods in each city stratified by the two or district in the city. In my survey, 89 neighborhoods had Dibao recipients, and 12 of them, in 12 of them, Dibao released prisoners received Dibao. And this is out of 13 neighborhoods where there were released prisoners. So what this means is that although it's relatively rare for there to be released prisoners in any particular neighborhood in urban China, when a neighborhood has released prisoners, almost always they're receiving Dibao. So that stands in pretty large contrast to the fact that among the normal population, only 20 to 30% of eligible households get Dibao. But if you're a released prisoner, basically over 90% are receiving Dibao. So what are the consequences of distributing Dibao to preempt disorder? I argue that giving Dibao to individuals to preempt threats to political order results in something called repressive assistance. So repressive assistance occurs when material benefits raise the contender's cost of taking action. We usually associate political repression with physical sanctions and violence, or at the very least, the threat of physical force. But if we look to older definitions of repression, they really emphasize repression as any action by a group that raises the contender's cost of action or cost of collective action in particular. And this concept of repressive assistance builds repression doesn't need to be physically violent or threaten violence in order to raise the cost of action. In repressive assistance, in the Dibao program, the distribution of benefits creates opportunities for repeated interactions, and it serves to make those who are receiving benefits much more legible to the state and more amenable to influence, because through the distribution of benefits, there develop bonds of obligation as well as dependence. And this differs, so there's been a lot of research on how welfare is used for co-optation. But repressive assistance differs in a couple of ways. Repressive assistance is not co-optation or clientelism because there's no exchange. So in co-optation, benefits are distributed to buy off those who in exchange willingly forgo some specific activity. But that's not the case with repressive assistance. In repressive assistance, it's not a willful decision to say, I will stop doing this so that I can get a material benefit. Material benefits are provided, and as a result of those material benefits, those recipients are not only less willing, but just less able to engage in activities that those who are providing benefits want to suppress. Finally, one way this repressive assistance is different than many studies of welfare in authoritarian regimes is that previous research is really focused on how autocrats design welfare programs to achieve goals of social control. But in this case, the initial motives for Dibao have really changed. And the reason why Dibao acts as repressive assistance is not by design, but through seepage. Okay. Finally, I also look at the consequences of distributing Dibao in this way to people who don't receive benefits. If we look at China's overall population, urban Dibao recipients are a very small share of the population. And so it's important to look at everyone else. What's the effect of distributing Dibao to preempt disorder on everyone else? And the main finding there is that it leads to backlash. I look at a variety of different types of evidence, both at the very granular neighborhood level as well as the city level. And what I find is that there's a backlash among other poor households who do not receive benefits about deservingness. So there's a lot of anger, including small level collective protests and collective action events over who's deserving of getting Dibao benefits. And so there's contention over distribution. So what's important here to note is that the contention and protests are not happening because of anger over repression. It's really about deservingness and the distribution itself. Okay, so what does this all mean? I think for a lot of books on China, there's the inevitable question of what does this mean for the durability or survival of the Chinese regime? Some people who have heard me give this talk will say, well, it looks like this program is working really well. Without Dibao, there would be more discontent. Targeted populations who are getting Dibao are demobilized through repressive assistance. Repressive assistance is demobilizing. And others who don't get benefits, well, they're upset and they're complaining, but it's really small scale collective action and they're not threatening the regime. And I think that's correct, but I don't think that's the right way to think about it. For me, the right comparison is what would happen if Dibao were fully funded? What would happen if the priority of political order did not seep into these unrelated programs? And I think what my research shows is that, despite China's institutions and its high level of state capacity, its fixation on order undermines its programmatic promises that it's made. And it appears really unlikely right now that China will loosen its grip on social control and turn away from its pursuit of order. So what ends up happening is a cycle where there's tightening of social control in order to try to mitigate the problems produced by its quest for stability. So in pursuing stability, you lead to Dibao, it shifts the Dibao distribution. That shift in distribution leads to additional contention over the program and additional things like protests that then the regime needs to try to control further. So that's what I mean by the cycle of tightening control in order to mitigate problems caused by tightening control. I'll stop there for today. I really look forward to the discussion and to your questions. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you so much for doing all this research, producing this wonderful book. And I want to encourage people to get the book. It opens with this very graphic tale of the Wang family and the Li family, pseudonyms. And we see both families are qualified. They meet the requirements for the program, but only one of the families gets those benefits. And it's because Mr. Li is a former prisoner. And so that comes through from the very beginning of this book. And Professor Pan takes us through quite a journey on this. We explore motivations. We see how the policies have evolved. And that's where I'd like to begin. You've made it so clear that for the Chinese state, stability, political order is job one, morning, noon, and night. And that in the book, you also explain how cadre are going to be evaluated on the basis of their preservation of the order. And you've just explained how this winds up seeping into the Dibao program. You mention in the book, you mention a lot of other programs where it has come into being, education and other sorts of things. But it's definitely present in how, and you make a very compelling case, in the Dibao system. Now, if the system, and you also make the point that it's not the civil affairs folks who have changed the policy, it's that they are now being co-opted in to the security apparatus, that they also need to provide that. Could you elaborate on that? And can you discuss, is there any kind of pushback from anyone? Because of your extensive reading of the documents, do any of these officials who are charged with trying to keep people who are on the brink of subsistence in survival mode, do any of them say, hey, we need to take care of everyone with this need and not prioritize these targeted populations?
Yeah, thank you for that question. When talking to both grassroots, so neighborhood level administrators of the program, as well as policymakers in the Dibao program, what I hear is them saying, we wish there was just more funding from local governments, from central government transfers for the program, because there are a lot of needy households who don't get the benefit. But I don't really hear them push back against this particular prioritization, because it's absolutely the case that targeted populations who are getting these benefits are extremely impoverished. So because there's never a violation of the kind of programmatic features, you don't see the pushback of from the administrators that they wish they can give it to another household rather than a particular recipient. I think another related idea is that oftentimes when we think of China, we might think of like fragmented authoritarianism and competition between bureaucracies. And is there competition between public security, justice, and civil affairs over this? And the particular instance, I actually don't see competition because the funding for Dibao is fixed, and this is not decreasing the funding for civil affairs. Instead, it's just shifting the allocation within. And if anything, kind of this partnership, co-optation, or you're referring to co-optation of civil affairs into public security, has raised the kind of prestige of civil affairs. Because political order is so high priority, now civil affairs can get into that a little bit. So this is a case where really don't see that fragmentation among bureaucracies and that competition.
Thank you. And we know that China now spends more money on domestic security, on internal policing, than it does on its external defense budget. And so we definitely understand that that's priority one and that sort of thing. Now, in your survey, you showed that 8 out of 10 households who qualify are not getting the support unless they happen to have someone who is among this in this targeted population, and then it's almost absolute. 9 out of 10 get that. We have a question from the audience, and it's a good one. If the budget allocation for Dibao is the big problem, that in fact, the officials would be happy to dole it out more fully, what would it cost to fund Dibao? And keeping in mind that the provisions for this and the work requirements, all these kinds of things, it's not as though you're going to be living well based on Dibao support. So maybe you could say something about where this program really exists in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, so if this program were fully funded, it would actually not be particularly expensive. In 2017, there were about 12.6 million participants in urban Dibao, with 64 billion Chinese yuan. That's like very, very little. So it could absolutely be fully funded. But I think I didn't emphasize that as much in this talk. I just mentioned it at the beginning. There is resistance to programs like Dibao, just like there is in the US to welfare programs. Many people have the view that you're going to give people money and people are not going to work. So I think there is this other dynamic happening that is putting pressure on local governments and probably central policymakers as well to not fully fund or expand the program. If you look, and then add on top of that, you have central mandates around poverty reduction that, you set that target, the target is going to be met. Mm-hmm. So that means you can't have too many people who are impoverished. And so when you look at the trends in the Dibao program, you see it increasing and then it being capped, and participants, if anything, declining. And when I, in my fieldwork, talk to local government, this is actually beyond the civil affairs, so local mayors, they'll say, next year we're going to have this many recipients. And that's not, it should be based on need, right? It's not, you're not supposed to be setting a cap, but that's actually what's happening at the policy implementation level.
Now, the notion of a quota or a cap, that sort of thing, as opposed to an absolute means tested. It is a means tested program, but it's not as though it's an entitlement. Simply qualifying doesn't mean you get it. And that was what comes through with your research, is that households, on the brink, in desperate circumstances, through no fault of their own, they need some support. And maybe you could elaborate a little bit about that back and forth and the extent to which there is back and forth between the impoverished, the needy, and those who control the purse.
Yeah, so there's, you see this really clearly at the neighborhood level. So I should clarify that the Dibao application process, you have to apply through your neighborhood residence committee. They're not the ones who are approving your application, but they're the ones who gather all the information, in particular, assessments of income. And so when households approach the residence committee, the default, if the household is not under surveillance, is to ask, is for the resident committee to kind of do an on-the-spot assessment of how likely are you to get this benefit. Right. And most kind of families who approach the residence committee, if it's not an elderly who doesn't have family to support them, if it's not someone who is, because of other reasons, can't participate in the labor market, they're told, oh, it's really hard to get this benefit. There are way more people who want it than there's available resources. It's really a difficult process to apply. You shouldn't apply. And sometimes that works. Sometimes that works. But when households are told, look, you can work, everyone who gets this is somehow not able to work. But in neighborhoods where they see targeted populations getting the benefit, that actually stimulates a lot more bargaining and a lot more negotiation. So in neighborhoods where, I should say in urban neighborhoods, everyone who's a Dibao recipient is publicized. Right. There are these neighborhood bulletin boards that list everyone's name, how much Dibao benefit they're getting. So for, excuse me, for others who are not getting the benefit, they might know their neighbors and say, if that person is getting these benefits, I should be too. They won't know who's the targeted population, like that designation is not public. But they'll see there's some discrepancy between I'm getting turned away, I'm told not to get this, but they're getting it. I think I have a similar financial situation. So you actually see a lot of negotiation and back and forth at this at the residence, at the neighborhood level.
And so the publication, putting up a sheet with the names and that sort of thing, it's intended, of course, to discourage people, because there is a certain amount of shame associated with this, but also to mobilize everybody to keep an eye on these folks, to make sure that they are worthy. But as you say, it stimulates this backlash because others who are equally deserving are not getting necessarily this. And that might lead to different things, which leads to a question you address in the book about, okay, does this work? Does this work? A program that had its origins to deal with the difficulty that China had with its economic reforms, how privatization was throwing people out of work, people were encountering troubles in the early 90s, all of those sorts of things, the difficulty that people had and that the system wasn't otherwise set up to deal with, right? Because so much had been based on your work unit and that sort of thing. And now you were cast adrift. And so here you had the state stepping in. And then over time, the stability question becomes the end of it in itself, that political order becomes that end. And so your argument is that this is welfare for autocrats. This is welfare to help support the state. Does it work?
I think it depends on what we mean by working for the state. So if we look at people who are receiving benefits, they're marginalized, they are demobilized. But what I didn't talk about in the presentation, but which I do talk about in the book, is who are placed into these categories. Yeah. It's very difficult. This is a predictive policing, predictive surveillance. Mm-hmm. And China, doesn't have psychics. So this is like, if you read the book or seen the movie Minority Report, this is pre-crime. In the absence of being able to predict the future, public security bureaus rely on past characteristics in order to place people into these categories. And there are, I think, based on my research fieldwork, many people who are placed into targeted populations who really had no likelihood, very low likelihood of doing anything to threaten what the Chinese government would call threats to stability in the first place. So in terms of that, maybe it's not very effective. But I think, again, it really depends on whose perspective we're taking. If I'm taking the perspective of China's public security apparatus, maybe it's sufficient because they're able to hit their targets for targeted populations. And maybe there's a higher likelihood that those who are under surveillance, on average, will be likely to do something that the regime doesn't like, as opposed to the general population. One thing that I talk about in the conclusion of the book is how does this change in the digital era, as the public security apparatus in China is increasingly reliant on large-scale data, camera surveillance, deep learning models. So with the targeted population program, there's a lot of interest in applying those methods. But I think there's a big question of, well, I think this will expand the scale of this type of program, but it hasn't really changed the motives, underlying motives that have been around since the 1950s to try to predict future behavior. So kind of a long-winded answer to, is this effective? At a very narrow lens, we can say it's effective. Maybe for public security apparatus, it's effective because it allows them to hit their targets. But does it really promote stability? I'm not sure, because it does lead to more contention from those who are turned away from the program. It generates compromises in the programmatic promises the CCP has made. So in some ways, it's kind of more systematically undermining the goals that the regime is trying to pursue. But I think as kind of China becomes so focused on stability, maybe that those other programmatic promises don't even matter anymore. I don't know. It's just as I mentioned, the self-perpetuating cycle of the need for control leads to the need for more control.
Well, that's it. It's obviously an addiction to control and a desire to extend that control. One of the things that really comes through in your book is that it's not so much the money. The money is important, right? And you get some material assistance. That does matter. But from the state's monitoring perspective, it's the engagement. To get that, you have to have more interaction. And one of the things that you say in the book is, well, former prisoners and people suspected of X or Y, they're already getting that surveillance. And so this may not increase the surveillance, except that it includes new authorities, right? Looking at them and interacting with them.
Yeah, that's right. I think it just provides new opportunities for interaction in ways that seem to be unrelated to control. So we're talking about a benefit. It gives local administrators opportunities to regularly check up on you. For any social welfare program anywhere in the world, you have to provide a lot of information in order to qualify, in order to continue in the program. And so it makes monitoring much more innocuous and routine. Yeah.
And as you said, even in the United States, I shouldn't say even, but especially in the United States, to claim unemployment benefits, you have to constantly be engaged with that system. You have to show you're looking for work. You're doing those kinds of things. So that aspect of it is not unusual for China to do that. It's the trade-off. It's the accountability sort of question. Now, we've received a lot of questions. We have attendees from the general public, but also scholars who specialize in politics, communication, who are experts on human rights and dissent and all sorts of things. And we've got a good collection of questions. And one of the things that comes up is, could you elaborate a little bit more about this digital age? You've already mentioned the idea of big data, predicting who's going to cause trouble, that sort of thing. The state, by the way it carries out this system, is providing grounds for dissent, grounds for protest. But maybe you could say a little bit more about the mechanism. Everybody has an ID card. Everybody now, many people now have, this digital existence. Maybe you could say something more about that.
Yeah, so I mean, from the evidence in the book, everything is in some ways pre-digital, even though it wasn't that long ago, but so much has changed. I think the one thing I can say, so I think there are some questions about digitization, both on the welfare system, as well as on potentially surveillance and this control side of things. On the welfare side of things, so one of the difficulties is that with the Dibao program, and why the local residence committees have so much power, is that it's very difficult to estimate income for people who are at that kind of very low income level, because employment is informal and it's very difficult to really understand or track income. With digitization and the movement to kind of cashless transactions, I think there's a bigger question mark there of, if everything is digital, how much will it be actually easier to ascertain income, even for those who are at the very low ends of the income stratum? If that's the case, I actually think it will be harder for local administrators to negotiate with Dibao applicants. Because right now there's a lot of things that are not transparent. And if then monetary income becomes fully transparent, even for those who are informally employed, it's going to be much harder for local administrators to turn away those and to kind of obfuscate exactly what is going on and the logics behind distribution. So if it becomes fully transparent that it's either you can't engage in the labor market, or you are kind of somehow engage in activities that place you in a particular category, then I think the dynamics will change. Kind of from the public security apparatus perspective, as digital systems expand the possibilities of surveillance, it wouldn't be surprising to see a situation in which many people who have no likelihood of threatening security or stability anyway are still put under control. Because what the system prioritizes is making sure that anyone who might commit some sort of future crime is captured, even if that means a lot of false positives, individuals who are falsely put under the system. In my research, which is pre-digital, you see that happening repeatedly.
Yeah, and you highlight, for example, that even this emphasis on former convicts, people who were in prison, they weren't in prison necessarily for political dissent. And so this is not aimed, with laser precision at the folks. There are people who may challenge state norms on theft and a lot of other things, but it's not laser-like focused on those who have a specific beef, a specific complaint with the Chinese state.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah. Now you've talked about about this being so underfunded. Could you say something about how the allocation is distributed? You've mentioned, for example, certain quotas and things like that. And could you imagine a circumstance, or have you seen a circumstance, where public security officials have advocated in the way, for example, that you do have now in the United States, some police departments who are saying, we need to spend more on mental health services or something like that? Do you have any public security folks who say, not that they would want their budgets cut, but that they want more money going to this system. And how is it distributed?
Yeah, so I actually haven't seen that because the Dibao program has been pretty path dependent in terms of the funding. So what's supposed to happen is that local governments are supposed to estimate, are supposed to have a handle on incomes and the distribution of incomes in their locality, and are supposed to estimate need and create a budget, which they submit, which are approved. And then once that budget is approved, then there's money that's earmarked for Dibao. So that money is not, you can't use it for anything else. It's earmarked for this particular purpose. And so what I said earlier about setting caps, that's not, the local governments are absolutely not supposed to be doing that. They're supposed to be assessing need. So kind of that interview, it was revealing in that there are other priorities going on. But I would say in terms of the budgets, you see a lot of consistency over time. You see this kind of small increases in budget over time.
And I could easily imagine an official for career reasons not wanting to say, we have so many more poor people than we can cope with. Saying to the higher ups, our economic growth hasn't been what it needs to be, because of course that's the other criterion upon which people are assessed, economic growth within their region. And so the incentive structure is to say, hey, we don't need this additional assistance.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. If you all of a sudden increase your budget for Dibao, then you're basically saying my poverty, the rate of poverty in my locality all of a sudden went up this year. And that, so yeah, that's also a big reason why you see this dependence over time. Stability over time and path dependence of budgets.
Yeah, that it's just carried over regardless of the actual need and the circumstances of the moment. Now, several people have asked, and you made passing reference to it in your presentation, and it's in the book too. How do we bring ethnic minorities into this, and how does this either fit or not fit with other systems of control?
Yeah, so I should say, just totally transparent, that in my book, none of the empirical evidence is based on minority regions, and my field work did not touch on ethnic minorities in China. I will say though, after the book came out, I actually heard from scholars of ethnic minorities in China who said that this resonates. They've seen repressive assistance, use of welfare benefits for these purposes in Xinjiang and among Uyghur populations and other ethnic minority populations that they study. So this is something I've heard after the book has come out. It's not directly, I don't have direct empirical evidence of it, but it seems to be that kind of this strategy of using welfare benefits, not for co-optation, but for control, is something that others have observed in minority regions in China.
And in your research and looking, you did interviews, you did all of this ground level work, and have followed, the discussions. And it seems very apparent that, the folks in the Ministry of Civil Affairs, they are still describing this as social welfare. That's what this is about. Meanwhile, and so you don't see that priority change in that side of the operation, even though they're the folks who are carrying this out. And so you explain that's what seepage means, where the priority for social stability and the emphasis that it is every official's job to carry it out. So even if it may not be in your, kind of formal mission statement, it is ultimately above you. We've had some people ask about the kinds of people who administer this. Is this the sort of thing that you do for your entire career? Or do people rotate in? Do they rotate out? That sort of, what kind of career trajectory do these officials have?
Yeah, so a lot of the administrators I'm talking about are those who are working in residence committees, so residence committee members. And these are people who are, actually, all state policies kind of converge on them. The same person who's assigning responsible in Dibao might be also working with the local patriots on security issues. A lot of them are kind of local, almost all of them are local to the area. And it's not a career path where you become anything at even the district or county level. You might go from being a residence committee to working in a kind of functional bureaucracy at the township 街道 level. But these are very much grassroots kind of administrators. This is not a kind of like path to political advancement or higher political office.
Yeah, this is not the route to becoming a county or city party committee member, let alone party chief,
No.
That sort of thing. This is your basic level bureaucrat who's likely to be doing similar kinds of things over and over and over.
Yeah.
And how does that play into how they see their role and their relationship to the people who they are ostensibly serving?
Yeah. So I actually think so. Yeah. These are street level bureaucrats. And the thing is, this kind of priority of political order being in the Dibao program, I don't think anyone who's involved sees anything nefarious. And I think that speaks to how much this priority has penetrated kind of even the public consciousness in China. Stability is important. We don't want chaos. And when these administrators are distributing benefits to targeted populations, it's described as bringing warmth, like 带温暖, 送温暖. So, and I mean, I think the fact that the program's programmatic characteristics are not violated helps that mindset, right? These are people who objectively are impoverished and in need of economic assistance. There's nothing to debate about that. And so for a lot of these grassroots administrators, they feel like they're doing some good. They're helping those who are in need. A lot of them wish that they could distribute benefits more broadly. They see others who they have to turn away, and it's not their desire to limit the benefits. But kind of because of their street level bureaucrats, that's the objective reality that they're in. And I don't think those that I interviewed, many want to do good, and they don't see anything nefarious in their actions.
Yeah, there's so many striking things. This is a wonderful book. It's very rich, obviously in data, but also in how the bureaucracy works. You get a really good sense from this book. And one of the things that comes across is when there's backlash, there's not backlash against the social stability agenda. The backlash is, where is mine? Why am I not benefiting? And so then the response is, there simply isn't enough.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's never a contention over this is being used in a repressive way. It's, I'm more deserving, or I'm also deserving. I should be getting these benefits.
Jennifer, this is a fantastic study. You have been very generous with your time, and we are anxious to have you back. You've obviously taken us inside the bureaucracy and shown us how this program, while well-intentioned at the outset, simply doesn't meet the need, for delivering social welfare as widely as it could. But for those who are in charge, it meets their need, or at least they think it meets their need. It's a gesture in that direction. If I could, for just a moment, take you off this topic and into this exciting study that you've initiated. As I mentioned at the outset, you've been writing on all sorts of different subjects having to do with communication. And one of the things, of course, with the COVID crisis is that we have these cases of atrocious bias and abuse of people of Asian ancestry, and particularly of Chinese people of Chinese ancestry. And you've looked at how students from China studying in the United States have responded, not in terms of organization or anything like that, but how this has affected their interpretation of their home country and of the place where they're studying. Would you mind giving us 30 seconds on this? I know, and we will have you back for a more elaborate discussion, but I just want to share that with the audience.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. The top line findings, so we have a longitudinal study of Chinese nationals who are in college in the US. We started following them 2 years ago when they were freshmen, and we continue to survey them every half year. And we want to track how their attitudes, opinions, and behaviors are changing over their 4 years in college in the US. And when COVID broke out, that was the same time we were planning to do a survey. So we included a survey experiment because at that point there was a lot of racist rhetoric around COVID. And so we conducted an experiment where we showed these college students, separated them into 3 groups. One group in which they read a US news report about COVID, and then, a Chinese media report about COVID in the US, and then Chinese social media discussions around COVID. That was our control condition. And another treatment group, they read a US article about COVID. It's actually COVID in China, about the death of Dr. Li Wenliang, apologies. Yeah. And then US social media discussions, which were critical of the Chinese government. That's the first treatment group. And then a second treatment group where they also saw the US media report, US social media posts, but half of those social media posts contain racist commentary linking the spread and emergence of COVID to kind of racial attacks. And what we find is that in that last group, those who saw those racist attacks, we see a greater support for China's political system, and decreased among that group of students, a decreased need in their minds for any sort of political reform in China. And really importantly, we don't see that effect at all in that second group. So it's not about facing criticisms of the Chinese government, its political system. It was really the racist attacks and rhetoric that led to this backlash. And so the top line message from this is a kind of racist rhetoric tying COVID kind of is a boon to Xi Jinping because it is diminishing kind of, at least among this population, their perception that there should be any change to China's status quo political system.
Yeah, it's a very interesting study that focuses on, again, it's not defense of China per se, because they embrace some of the criticism of, especially in the early going, the Li Wenliang story and others. It's the racist, the biased, blame Chinese language that and actions that really resonates with this group in a negative way from an American perspective. That it is a gift, as you would say, to the propaganda department in Beijing.
Yep. Yes.
Professor Pan, you have given us really quite a lot, and we're so grateful. This is your first time to speak virtually or in person at the USC US-China Institute, but I want to go ahead and publicly extend an invitation to have you come back and join us again soon to talk more about this other research that you've been doing for so many years, exploring the role of social media in China, how the Chinese government uses it, its tolerance for criticism, these kinds of things. You are doing fantastic work, and we're anxious to bring you back. And I want to promise all of the folks watching that we will do this. We will do this. We're grateful to Professor Pan, and we want to thank her with virtual hand claps. But we also want to thank all of you for giving us time this afternoon, this evening, to learn about this important study, Welfare for Autocrats. It's been a real privilege to host you today. We look forward to having you come back.
Thank you so much for having me.